Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's public lecture series. I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of our programme. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our return from the Easter break and a rescheduled lecture, which I've been looking forward to very much, and it's very topical, as you would expect. Our speaker joined the Foreign Office in 1998, 1 year into the new Labour years, and he served in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Yemen, in Baghdad in the years immediately after the invasion, before returning to London for 2 years to be deputy head of counter-terrorism at the Foreign Office, before going off to the relaxing environment of Helmand and deputy head of mission in Afghanistan. And his final diplomatic posting was as High Commissioner, which is an ambassador in the Commonwealth at Trinidad and Tobago, after which he resigned from the service and has served in a number of consultancy roles and publishes widely, including on the subject of this evening's talk, How Britain Broke the World. Please would you join me in welcoming Arthur Snell.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Genuinely, big honour for me to be here, to have the opportunity to talk to you all, and a very nice opportunity to come to Newcastle. I was reminiscing with Martin earlier. I have visited Newcastle University before, but it was in October 1999, and I've not had the chance to come back since. So I'm a bit overdue a return visit. So the first thing I want to do is just acknowledge a slight irony, which is here I am standing in a university lecture theatre, and I've written a book about, among other things, how Britain's inability to take advantage of expertise and really put expertise at the heart of our policy process has undermined the effectiveness of our diplomacy over the years, and it's ended up in us making bad foreign policy choices. And here I am in a university lecture theatre. I'm not an academic, and I'm basically an amateur delivering a lecture to a room full of possible experts. So I acknowledge that irony there. So I published this book last year, How Britain Broke the World, and I'm just going to read a short extract from, actually it's the first chapter. So, since Tony Blair's first election victory in 1997, Britain has contributed to the fracturing of the global order. Brexit is a symptom of that fissure. Britain has often acted in a way that has reduced global security, increased instability, and undermined trust between nations and between individuals and their governments. Put bluntly, a lot of the bad stuff happening right now is happening because of Britain. Britain talks self-centeredly of punching above our weight, strangely stimulated by the idea that its virility depends partly on its ability to be disproportionately powerful. But it doesn't seem very interested in whether it is punching the right people in the right places, or whether it should be punching at all. So I'm going to start by mentioning this concept of the rules-based international order, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And for those that are not, in briefest possible terms, we're talking about the structures that took shape largely after the end of World War II, but of course they formed over a prolonged period of time, particularly with the United Nations at its core, and this idea that the UN Security Council is a kind of supreme international body that is there to try to regulate peace between nations. And of course, you have the UN Charter, and the UN Charter says lots of things, but one thing the UN Charter is very clear about is about territorial integrity, that sovereign states exist within their borders and that other states must respect that. And of course, for those of you who are interested in history will know that throughout history this hasn't been the case, and that the development of this idea of there being a supranational body that would regulate the way that states behave with each other has helped to limit the number of wars. That's not to say that wars never happen. Of course they do. Invasions still happen, but they're much more limited than the post-World War II period. particularly in terms of intrastate conflicts and invasions. But we're speaking, of course, in 2023, and in February 2022, one large country invaded another country. I'm talking obviously about Russia invading Ukraine. And I think you could argue that the rules-based international order may have breathed its last, but it certainly is in critical care. So what does this have to do with Britain? It's clearly not Britain's fault that Putin invaded Ukraine. But we have to be realistic about what Britain is. So the first thing I want to do is actually sort of think about what is Britain as a country. Because sometimes in these debates, you end up with people taking a very a sort of particular approach. So some people will talk about Britain is just a small island, it no longer matters, and in a way that Britain has sort of allowed itself to become irrelevant. That's a formulation that I've certainly heard quite a lot. And of course, I mean, that's basically factually incorrect. So, in fact, even geographically, we're the 7th largest island nation in the world. And the island of Great Britain is a large island. If you look at the world, you know, there are not that many island nations larger. And of course, geography isn't that important, but we have a large economy. We remain, of course, in the G7. We have a powerful military. We are a rich and highly influential country. We may not be as influential as we were once. And of course, we are a soft power superpower. We were talking earlier, I had the opportunity to meet some of Martin's undergraduate students, and we all know the power of English football here in Newcastle, hardly needs talking about. And of course, that power extends to it being a product that is of interest to other global powers, such as Saudi Arabia, as you all know very well. So let's be realistic. Britain is not a small, irrelevant country. And the role that Britain often plays in the modern world, we are no longer a superpower. We are not an imperial power. We are not the power that we were in the 19th century. But we are often, we take a role which is a bit like what is known in finance and economics as a marginal buyer. So if you imagine the stock market or the commodities market, the price for a certain commodity will be set by the person who's willing to pay the highest price. You know, at a certain point, someone is willing to pay a certain price for oil, and that is the price that gets defined. We are, I think, in geopolitical terms, often the equivalent of that marginal buyer. So Britain has often been the geopolitical player without whom certain events or incidents would not have happened. That doesn't mean we're the most important or the most powerful, but we're the one who's, if you like, has swinged the balance, tipped the balance. So I'm going to start this talk, and also, you know, my book starts with the Tony Blair era. Now, that's partly down to my own life story. As Martin mentioned, I joined the Foreign Office around the time that Blair had been elected in the late 90s. But of course, also, actually, that moment in world history, albeit quite recent history, is, I think, a very transitional one. So, of course, the Cold War had ended. The late 90s were a period of comparative global peace and stability. And we're in the pre-9/11 era and the post-Cold War era. So if we go back to May 1997, literally in the few days after that election when Blair won for the first time, Robin Cook, who of course was Tony Blair's first foreign secretary, he gave a speech outlining the new government's approach to foreign policy. And people remember that speech often for a misquote. He was misquoted as having said that we needed an ethical foreign policy. In fact, he said there should be an ethical dimension. We'll come on to that. But if you go back to the speech, it's quite interesting what he doesn't talk about. He doesn't talk about warfare. He doesn't talk about terrorism. He doesn't talk about famine or extremism. These are sort of things that perhaps in our current era we would think of as core elements of a big foreign policy speech. And And 1997 was one of the most peaceful years of the 20th century, so he didn't really need to mention those things. He was able to focus on the priority of that new Labour government, which, as I mentioned, was foreign policy must have an ethical dimension, I'm quoting him, must have an ethical dimension and must support the demands of other peoples for the democratic rights on which we insist for ourselves. So what you see there is Robin Cook is talking about how foreign policy should support this wider moment of transition that the world was going through. And certainly in the minds of people at that time, the Cold War had ended. Some people talked about, of course, the end of history. Again, that's a concept which has been much contested and misunderstood. But that there was this theory, certainly in some wealthy countries of Western countries, that basically liberal democracy was the future, and there was a one-way sort of march of progress that was going to go across the world. And in that sense, the concept of a liberal international order, that was a kind of the right ideology for that period of history. But of course, Europe was not at peace. And that's why I've got Kosovo up there. Yes, the late 90s were comparatively a peaceful era in sort of global terms, but we know that the former Yugoslavia was in this kind of slow motion breakup, which had begun right at the beginning with Slovenia becoming independent, very peacefully, really, a very brief conflict there. But as this long-term unraveling of Yugoslavia occurred, it got sort of bloodier and more complex. So in January 1999, 45 Kosovo Albanians were killed by Serbian security forces, and there was an EU forensic mission at the time, and they looked into this, and it was clear that these had been civilians. There were allegations on the Serbian side of Kosovar terrorists, but clearly the victims of this massacre were unarmed civilians. So this is when public opinion in NATO countries starts to swing behind the idea of an armed intervention to protect the Kosovo Albanians. But of course the legal basis for such an intervention was questionable unless there was a UN Security Council authorization. And this is because Kosovo was part of a country called Yugoslavia at that time. It had not achieved independence. It was not recognized. There wasn't a group of countries lining up to recognize its independence. Now, at this time, the British view on whether or not there could be military action was rather different to that of other European partners, and particularly France and Germany. And basically, the French view, and definitely which was reflected in Germany as well, was that NATO could use force only under the auspices of a UN Security Council resolution. So going back to that structure that I very briefly outlined at the beginning of the talk, that there was a sort of global order, and that global order included the UN Security Council. And the British took a different view. They said that the UNSCR was unnecessary. And this was actually new for Britain as well. So in 1991, as many of you will know very well, of course, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and there had been a huge international response to that, with the UN at the heart of it. And Britain was very a forceful proponent of the UN being at the heart of that response to Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. And in fact, after the end of the conflict, there were sort of studies being undertaken in the Foreign Office about how we could broaden the role of the UN in global affairs on the back of what was seen as a success of the response to Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. So this idea that the UN Security Council, when it was convenient, could be jettisoned was new for Britain, as well as being a bit of an outlier in European terms. But it's also, we should recall, this wasn't the case of Britain trying to follow America. We were trying to lead America. So Britain was if we think of Tony Blair at that time, Blair was arguably, we're talking, 1999, was arguably the preeminent sort of democratic political leader on planet Earth at the time. I'm not saying that he was in terms of his personal power, but in terms of his profile, his ability to appear convincing. And in fact, Blair was what you might call the propagandist-in-chief for a NATO intervention in Kosovo. And Clinton, President Clinton, was pretty lukewarm on the idea, and not least because he had a very difficult situation in Congress at the time. Some of you will remember there was the Monica Lewinsky scandal, there were other issues. Clinton was not well placed to sort of launch his country into a military operation. So Kosovo was Blair's war, it wasn't Clinton's. So, as I say, Britain was sending this message that the international order could be kind of flipped over if there was some higher moral purpose. And I think if we look at the contrast here, so if you are a superpower like America, in a way that the rules limit you. So if you think about it, global rules limit America's freedom of action. By definition, it's freedom to use overwhelming force against its adversaries. But by contrast, if you're Britain, global rules enhance your influence. By definition, Britain's power and influence is enhanced by its permanent membership of the UN Security Council. So if we circumvent or undermine the UN, we obviously undermine our own influence. Now, many of you will be well aware of what happened in the event in Kosovo. An aerial 78-day aerial bombardment took place. There was an expectation that after a couple of days the Serbs would back down. There was this thought that that the sort of almighty firepower of the NATO alliance would cause the Serbian leader Milosevic to take his forces out of the Kosovo area and stop the human rights abuses. In fact, the opposite happened. What they did, as the air war began, they sped up. They did more. They carried out more. There were more massacres. There were people were driven from their homes, so-called ethnic cleansing, and a huge refugee crisis occurred. So it's interesting because we look back, and here's this article. This is an extraordinary thing. In Kosovo, you'll see there are people who have this name, Tony Blair. Tony Blair is a huge hero in Kosovo, and not without reason. You know, Kosovo is now an independent country. Without Blair's intervention, that probably would not have happened. But if we're actually very specific about the impact of NATO's air war, it caused more suffering, more intense activity by the Serbian forces on and against Kosovo Albanians. So the impacts of the Kosovo war, I would argue, are less simple than perhaps some people think in retrospect. And I think then there are geopolitical impacts as well. So the other thing that was happening in 1999 in Europe in a significant way was basically the collapse of Russia. Russia was coming to the end of a decade of complete chaos. It had obviously, in 1991, the Soviet Union had broken up. Russia's economy had collapsed. The ruble had defaulted, and so on. And in 1999, the Russians felt that they had been completely humiliated. In fact, there was a moment when Yevgeny Primakov, the foreign minister, was flying across the Atlantic to attend a sort of summit, and then basically the decision was taken on Kosovo while he was in the air. And it was this sort of humiliating moment for Russia. If we think about Vladimir Putin, he builds so much of his platform on this idea of Russian humiliation and how Russia must never again be humiliated, and Russia must sort of correct these past slights, and this kind of nostalgia for the great days of the Soviet Union. So when in 2014 Putin invaded Crimea and he gave this very triumphant speech to the Russian parliament, he stated, and I'm quoting him now, "It was our Western partners who created the precedent. They did it themselves with their own hands in a situation that was totally analogous to the Crimean situation by recognizing Kosovo's secession from Serbia as legitimate." Now, I'm not for a moment saying that we should say that Putin was justified in 2014, but we can't pretend he wasn't influenced by this precedent. So you've got this thing where there are definite problems with what happened in Kosovo. I'm not saying that there were not also benefits. You know, ultimately, as I say, Kosovo achieved its independence. But the difficulty is that Kosovo was, as I've written here, a failure that looked like a success. From hindsight, Tony Blair saw that being an outlier on military action, being an outlier on ignoring the UN Security Council, was a successful undertaking. And I think that fed very heavily into what would happen a few short years later in 2003, prior to the invasion of Iraq. So to understand the significance of Britain's role in the run-up to Iraq war, we have to understand the significance of British intelligence in making the case for war. And so you'll see here, this is CIA Director George Tenet talking to his Iraq operations chief. SIS, as I'm sure you all know, is the official name for MI6, the British Intelligence, Foreign Intelligence Organization. George Tenet, the head of the CIA, this is only a few months after the 9/11 attacks. America is still reeling from an extraordinary event, a terrible, obviously tragic event. And at that time, the CIA did not have intelligence on Iraq. They were relying on MI6. And through 2002, so this is in February, as 2002 unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that the Americans want to start a war against Iraq. And this is on this idea that Iraq is somehow a threat to the global order, which has been sort of opened up as a result of 9/11. And at the heart of this argument was the concept that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and the fear that these weapons of mass destruction, of course, would get into the hands of terrorists and threaten the free world, but particularly America. So in early September 2002, there was an MI6 report from a new source which offered, in the words, actually the description given to it by Richard Dearlove, who at the time was the chief of MI6, this new source offered phenomenal access to Iraq's biological and chemical weapons program. And basically, this report, we're talking September 2002, explained that Iraq was actively developing biological and chemical weapons, and that plans existed to use these weapons. So now this, we all know how this story ends, but you have to put yourself in the mind frame of September 2002. This was dynamite. Remember, the CIA hasn't got good reports, good sources in Iraq. MI6 has come up and said, not only is there a risk of this is actually happening. There are live programs, they're developing these weapons, and plans exist for their use. And this is after years. Iraq had been under sanctions, UN weapons inspections, you name it. So this seemed to show that in spite of all the international containment activity, Saddam still had access to these deadly weapons. And of course that makes a powerful case for war, particularly in the light of the 9/11 attacks. So this report that I've mentioned, this MI6 report, was so significant that Richard Dearlove, the chief of MI6, he took it personally to the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee. He took it to the Prime Minister himself, to Tony Blair himself, and to Blair's foreign policy advisor, as well as one or two other very, very senior officials. Now, of course, the question is, well, who is the source? Is this valid intelligence? Well, the source was classed as developmental, which meant that it was a new source. They didn't, they were still checking it out. And internally, this intelligence was viewed as unproven. So the report, which had been shown around the top of the leadership of our country, came from a source that MI6 they couldn't even name. They didn't even know who it was. They couldn't identify this person. And the readers of the report, the Prime Minister, John Scarlett, they were not told that. So they were not told the weakness of this intelligence. So if you think about, you put yourself in Tony Blair's shoes, John Scarlett's shoes, those people are not specialists. They're not specialists on chemical weapons. They're not specialists on biological weapons. Now, those experts do exist. We have specialists in our system, of course, in the DIS, Defence Intelligence Staff. And so in the British system, the the kind of specialist analysts, particularly on weapon systems, are found there, which is it's a specialist part of the Ministry of Defence. Richard Dearlove, who had taken this report around Downing Street and so on, actually decided that the DIS experts didn't see the report. The report stated that deadly nerve agents had been produced at an Iraqi facility and loaded into containers which were linked hollow glass spheres. You see this? Like that. That's what this report said. Now, if you're a chemical weapons expert, you will know that linked hollow glass spheres have never been used in any real-life deployment of chemical or biological weapons. However, they do feature prominently in the 1996 action movie, The Rock. Here's Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage. And you can see that there's this moment. And it's, so this is a biological weapon, VX. Right. So these reports were in that famous dossier. You might remember the intelligence dossier, which said that Iraq could launch WMD within 45 minutes. And that was put out into the public to try and influence all of us to support the war. Within a month of these reports actually being issued, members of the intelligence community began to raise concerns. And by December, so I remember the reports started in September, by December 2002, internally within MI6, there was basically a question that the entire reporting chain had been invented. And by mid-February 2003, so we're now talking just a couple of weeks before the actual invasion, or about a month before the actual invasion, this source had revealed to have been lying. So before the war began, we knew that those reports were untrue. However, MI6 didn't tell Number 10 that the reports were untrue. And in fact, in April, after the invasion of Iraq, when there was still a belief that the WMD was there waiting to be found, these reports were reissued and sent to a wider readership. So anyway, this is to illustrate a key point that WMD intelligence produced by the Brits was wrong. Well, we all know that. The important question is, would the invasion have happened anyway? Because, the United States was going to do what they were going to do, whatever MI6 said, whatever the intelligence. That's the conventional wisdom. I think it's possible to examine that. I'm not saying that I know the opposite to be the case, but on the 12th of March, which is 8 days before the start of the war, when there was a bit of a wobble in the UK and the thought that the UK might not actually go through with it, Donald Rumsfeld would ask, would the United States go to war without Great Britain? He was asked, Donald Rumsfeld, the US Defense Secretary, was asked in a press conference. And he basically said, yes, we can do it without the Brits, wouldn't be a problem. And he specifically said there are workarounds. So he was obviously slightly shooting from the hip, as he had a habit of doing. But instead of the American system saying, yes, that's correct, we would do this without the Brits, there was a furore. It became very clear that it was not acceptable for the Americans to say publicly that they'd go to war without the Brits. And in fact, Rumsfeld, a few hours later, had to issue a clarification where he said, I have no doubt of the full support of the United Kingdom. So we assume, and it's I think, popular kind of assumption that the Americans were going to invade Iraq with or without us. But actually, when Rumsfeld was asked 8 days before the war, he made clear that wasn't a possibility. Would there have been an Iraq war without this intelligence? Even if we were still involved, if British intelligence had said, well, actually, there isn't any WMD, would the Americans have listened? That's another good question. Well, if we try and understand the impact, and the reason I'm going on about this is it's about the power that Britain has, the impact that our intelligence had. So in January 2003, George W. Bush gave his State of the Union address. As you all know, this is the annual speech that the US president gives. It's incredibly high-profile speech. Every word is carefully written and thought through. And in that speech, 2003, Bush said, the British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Now, it's we could talk all night just about this one thing, but basically there was a report doing the rounds of world intelligence agencies for most of 2002 that the Iraqis had tried to get uranium from Niger, the West African country. And that report was thoroughly debunked. It was proven to be completely incorrect for all kinds of reasons. There were fake documents involved, not credible. And so if you want to use that report to argue that the Iraqis have a nuclear weapons program, you can't. It's fake, right? So why is George W. Bush saying the British government has learnt that? Here's why. Because whilst the CIA had debunked this story, whilst the Italian intelligence agency had debunked this story, whilst the UN Atomic Agency, Atomic Energy, IAEA, had debunked the story, for some reason, which to this day it's not very easy to understand, and even with all the releases from Chilcot, for some reason British intelligence insisted that the story was correct, even though it was clearly not. So what that meant was, it was possible for George W. Bush to say, the British government says this. The British government is a credible brand. We're the Brits. We have MI6. We have James Bond. We have Sean Connery. If we say it, it might be true. George Bush's own intelligence agency had already proved this to be false. You have another case of this. So do you remember the famous Colin Powell presentation to the UN Security Council? Some of you might remember that. He basically, again, making the case for war. There was a lot of intelligence that went into that, which had come, again, there was an Iraqi defector who had the code name Curveball, which maybe the name gives you a hint. He defected through to Germany initially. The German intelligence said, we don't think this guy is very credible, but they did debrief him. They made lots of reports, but they put a big sort of caveat over it. The Americans looked at it and they thought, yeah, this stuff isn't credible. But for reasons that may start to become rather clear from listening to me go on about this stuff, the Brits have decided, no, we think Curveball's right. So again, Colin Powell was relying on Curveball material that had come through the UK pipe, because then it was validated. Even though he knew that Powell himself, I don't think he did know, but the American system knew that their own intel agencies had ruled this stuff out. So what we're seeing here is a kind of slapdash approach, a reluctance to rely on experts, in fact, shielding experts from seeing some of this intelligence, as I mentioned. But what if we'd done it the other way around? Had British intelligence applied appropriate validation and analytical resources, maybe we would have found that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Would we have stood up to America? Would we have perhaps urged them to focus on operations in Afghanistan rather than this kind of costly sideshow in Iraq? And of course, the long-term impacts of the Iraq war, the impact on this country. So even if the war had happened but we hadn't been involved, I think the impact on this country and a collapse in trust, radicalization of certain communities and so on, it's clear. And then we obviously, the much bigger impact in Iraq and the region, of course, happens to this day. So I sort of went on that slight rabbit hole about intel because it seems to me that it shows something about the way Britain does its foreign policy. We don't like experts. We are somehow reluctant to bring them in to our decision-making sort of procedures. And the phenomenon of the British generalist, I think, is a bit of a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's real. And in fact, in writing a book, I looked at the. We'll come back to that. I looked at the sort of CVs of senior diplomats in foreign service in the US and the French foreign service, and you find that a lot of them have academic degrees, not just undergraduate, but masters and doctorates in the area that they work in. So, the director of the Middle East region might well have a doctorate in Middle East studies and that sort of thing. And it'll be there on the website. So on the Quai d'Orsay or the State Department website, it'll be there. Whereas if you look on the British Foreign Office site, you can't find any of this information. So then I thought, well, I did a Freedom of Information request to the Foreign Office to ask what proportion of the leadership of the staff hold a postgraduate qualification related to their policy work. And the response I got was, we have no reason to hold this information, which I think tells you all you need to know. There are other aspects to this. This is not just about Iraq, it's not just about Kosovo. You can see this tendency in other aspects of British foreign policy. So let's think about George Osborne spearheading what he called the golden era of relations with China. Some of you might remember this, that there was a sense that Britain was falling behind in its economic connections with China at a time when other European countries were sort of expanding theirs. And I'm talking about, this is the sort of David Cameron era, so the 2010s. And George Osborne decided that he would kind of revolutionize that relationship. And the basic model for that was to say to the Chinese, okay, well, you get what you want. We won't make a fuss about what you're doing in the South China Sea, where you're making territorial claims that have no legal basis. We won't keep going on about the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We will let you into sensitive technology here in our country. And that was going fine until the Americans said, well, hang on a minute. We've got the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, and you're not going to be able to continue to receive intelligence if you wire up your 5G mobile network with Huawei technology. Now, the reason I give that case study, because it seems to me that that's a classic example of a lack of forward thinking. You know, the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which puts the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, is the oldest and most effective intelligence alliance in the world. We could debate the validity of it, whether or not it needs to evolve or change or whatever, but it is right at the heart of our foreign policy and national security architecture. No British politician or senior civil servant would get anywhere by saying, oh, I don't think the Five Eyes really matters very much. So how is it that we couldn't have the kind of strategic foresight to think, well, if we bring Huawei into our 5G mobile networks, that might give us some problems in America. And of course, the combination of that lack of attention to expertise goes with this sort of relaxed approach to international law. And I mentioned, obviously, you know, the Iraq War being launched without a UN Security Council resolution, and of course on the back of the Kosovo conflict. But that combination of a kind of a lack of respect for expertise, a disinclination to forward planning, arguably reached its apotheosis with Brexit. Of course, again, with the luxury of hindsight, we can all see how people hadn't really thought through Brexit very much. But yeah, putting it mildly. But if you think a country such as Britain, which has had a remarkable amount of stability, a remarkable amount of both constitutional stability, but also, you know, being an island nation, we've avoided serious, you know, land warfare on our own territory for centuries. The idea that we would make a choice which completely revolutionized our foreign policy, our constitutional status, all kinds of legal issues, without any consideration, for example, of, well, you know, when we vote on this referendum, will there be a specific platform that we're voting for, or is it just the idea of leaving? Is there a minimum threshold? Does it have to be half of the actual electorate? Or, you know, none of those things were taken into account. And of course, we had Brexit itself then opened the door to more of our undermining international law. You know, famously in the Northern Ireland Protocol, which, you know, may have been resolved. I hope so. But let me just share with you. Just after the Brexit vote, I had left government service, but I, you know, still mix in this crowd, as it were. I remember I was in Stockholm talking to Swedish defense intelligence experts, And they were saying that all the Nordic countries were absolutely devastated by the Brexit vote because they saw one of the main attractions of joining the EU, and don't forget, of course, the Nordic countries joined later, they were not founder members, was the idea that they were in a club with Britain that made Europe stronger and helped them stand up to Russia. They were saying this in 2016, not after the events of last year, but back then. And for them, that was a major part of what we had done by being in the EU, and by leaving the EU, we had increased international disorder. So this sort of disinclination to follow the rules, dislike for expertise, refusal to think of long-term implications, that's all there. But I thought we should, I wanted to bring this right up to date and actually talk about the thing that's sort of on everyone's lips this week, which is Sudan. So the first thing I want to reiterate, and I think I said it earlier on when I talked about Ukraine, I certainly don't think it's Britain's fault of what's happening in Sudan, and that's not my message with this book or even with this lecture. But if we want to talk about the Sudan war, we need to talk about the war in Yemen. The war in Yemen. So in March 2019, there are British special forces are on the ground fighting in Yemen. And the British government has never confirmed this, but there is a wide array of very credible reporting. It's absolutely not in doubt. So we talk about whether we were somehow supporting the Saudis. And you often hear about this. So this is UK export licenses approved for military goods to Saudi Arabia, 15, 16, 17. Anyway, so yes, we supplied the Saudis with weapons. And of course, we know that the Saudis in Yemen have carried out numerous bombings which have hit civilian targets, and it's open to debate whether they were actually intending to hit civilian targets. But the most generous thing you can say is that they were extremely poor at their targeting. But it goes further than that. We had our forces on the ground in Yemen. March 2019. April 2019, a British government statement is that there is no military solution to the war in Yemen. Now, if there is no military solution to a war, it's rather odd that you've got your troops fighting in it and you're supplying one of the main belligerents with weapons. I would argue that that is an incoherent policy. So I want to make it clear that I am not a kind of lily-livered peacenik. I am not saying that we shouldn't sometimes intervene. We might sometimes have allies that are unsavory. It might be necessary. But I think we should be coherent. We can't have a situation where we're in the war, but there's no military solution. In April 2019, the Court of Appeal banned arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It was found to be unlawful. And actually, it's interesting, that takes us back to Robin Cook. Robin Cook set up a framework for arms sales. And yes, the defense industry in this country is very big and very powerful, and we can be cynical about it, but there are laws that exist. And it was found that the way we were supplying the Saudis in this context was unlawful. But the British government found a way round. They did an internal review, and the internal review proved that it was okay because the Saudis weren't targeting civilians, so we ought to keep supplying them. So we resumed the sales. The ground troops are still in Yemen, obviously. And again, there's quite a lot of detailed material about this you can find online. August 21, we deployed a special SF unit to Yemen, which was definitely an expansion of what had previously been on the ground there. But in case you're not sure, in February 22, we still think there's no military solution to the war in Yemen. So we're consistent in that belief, albeit our behaviour doesn't appear to justify it. And even when the stuff was banned, we were still supplying them with weapons anyway. So, I mean, it was Liz Truss. You never know with her, do you? But this line, there is no military solution to the war in Yemen, is one that came up repeatedly, and in fact you can find, it's obviously a copy and paste that they put into government speeches. But I said I wanted to talk a bit about Sudan. So here we go, the war in Yemen, who is in Saudi Arabia's coalition. We're familiar with this. I'm sure some of you will know. Interestingly, this doesn't actually record that we had soldiers. It just says that we had arms and aircraft. But yeah, we supplied soldiers as well. And you'll see on here Sudan, who is in Saudi Arabia's coalition, Sudan, on the front line of the Saudi war in Yemen, child soldiers from Darfur. So let's talk a bit about the RSF, which all of us have become familiar with this thing, the RSF, which is the military, the sort of militia element of the Sudanese army, which is one of the belligerents in the current civil war in Sudan. As I'm sure many of you have read, if you've been following these recent events, the RSF came out of the Janjaweed, who were perpetrators of the genocide in Darfur. But what is perhaps less well known about the RSF is that in 2015, they were hired as a mercenary force by Saudi Arabia to fight the war in Yemen. So that's right. So at the same time, and they were there up until 2019. So at the same time as we had our forces on the ground fighting in Yemen in support of Saudi Arabia, the RSF mercenary force, the genocidal mercenary force from Sudan, was fighting there in Yemen. And what were they doing? Well, they were doing what you'd expect them to do. They were not treating people very nicely. They didn't fight in the same specific areas as the British troops. So I'm not suggesting that you would have had Brits and RSF sort of in the same battle in the same place. The RSF were mostly active on the coast here around Hodeidah. And actually they took a lot of casualties, and there's lots of evidence that basically what the Saudis and the Emiratis, who very much allied with the Saudis in this operation, what they were seeking to do was use the RSF basically as cannon fodder because they didn't want to lose too many of their own troops. But the RSF, another thing the RSF was involved in was gold mining in this area of Yemen. I used to live in Yemen, so it's a country dear to my heart. This area called Hadramaut is rich in minerals, including gold. And one of the ways that it was made more attractive to the RSF to be involved in this operation was effectively giving them control of gold mines. Now, the RSF, as some of you may have read about this, controls a lot of gold mines in Sudan. So this is something that they're already good at. So this is going back to a kind of 17th century model of warfare, where the army sustain themselves by comprehensively seizing whatever is available to them on the ground. So if we think then about the role of the RSF returned from the Yemen conflict better resourced, better connected, more militarily experienced, and obviously richer. And it is, of course, now that we see that the RSF are involved in the conflict in Sudan. Now, the RSF continues to get support from the Saudis and Emiratis. It's not clear, and I genuinely, I'm not saying that the answers to these things is always very straightforward. It is not clear exactly whether or not the RSF have been sort of green-lighted to do this current war by Riyadh. It looks like actually Riyadh's pretty unhappy with it, and similarly Abu Dhabi. But the point about this is that this is an element within Saudi Arabia that has had a very, very strong and close relationship. An element within Sudan has had a very strong and close relationship with Saudi Arabia. So when we think, again, about forethought, when Britain decided to join a civil war in Yemen on one side, as it happened, the Saudi side, did we think through the implications? Did we think about, well, what is it we're trying to do here? Are we deepening and prolonging intractable civil war, or are we somehow bringing peace and stability to the Arab Peninsula? So I suppose what I'm talking about here is that Britain doesn't act alone. My book is titled How Britain Broke the World, but I'm not saying that we're the only people who did the breaking. There are others involved. And we're not uniquely or specially bad, and I think in some cases we act with good intentions and we screw up. Whereas I don't believe that Putin does have good intentions. I don't see any case for the defense there. So I'm just going to finish by perhaps to illustrate this point about blame and who is responsible, to think about the whodunit novel, Murder on the Orient Express. And I'm going to give away the ending. So if any of you have not read it or don't know the story, please don't listen to what I'm about to say. When you get to the end of Murder on the Orient Express, the sting in the tail of the story is you find out they all did it. Everyone did the murder, not just one person. And so, rather like Murder on the Orient Express, Britain has not been the only culprit in the breakdown of the global order. But as we look at the broken state of the world, we have to admit that our fingerprints are on the dagger. Thank you for listening.